Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about medieval Christianity. Picture the scene: towering Gothic cathedrals, monks in flowing robes, the sweet scent of incense floating through stone corridors. Now imagine discovering that behind those sacred walls lived some of the most corrupt, sexually deviant, and morally bankrupt individuals in human history. The medieval Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution. It was a playground for the powerful, a brothel disguised as a sanctuary, and a criminal enterprise wrapped in holy vestments. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You think modern scandals involving religious figures are shocking? You haven't heard anything yet. What we're about to explore tonight makes contemporary controversies look like minor infractions. We're talking about an entire millennium where celibacy was treated as a polite suggestion, where papal courts functioned as high-end escort services, and where the phrase holy orders took on meanings that would make a sailor blush. The truth is, medieval priests weren't just breaking their vows. They were obliterating them with such creative enthusiasm that it defied imagination. From Pope Alexander VI, who openly acknowledged his illegitimate children and threw orgies in the Vatican, to countless village priests who treated their parishes like personal harems, the medieval church operated under what can only be described as theological anarchy. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. None of this was hidden. Chronicles, court records, papal bulls, and even church documents themselves provide overwhelming evidence of systemic corruption that lasted for centuries. This wasn't occasional misconduct. It was institutional policy disguised as religious devotion. The scale of what we're dealing with is staggering. We're not talking about isolated incidents or a few bad apples. We're examining a period spanning roughly from 800 to 1500 CE, where sexual misconduct among clergy was so normalized that satirical poems were written about it. Laws were passed trying to control it, and entire reform movements emerged solely to address it. You see, the medieval church had created the perfect storm for abuse. Absolute power, minimal oversight, and a population that couldn't read the very scriptures being interpreted for them. Priests held keys to salvation itself, and they weren't shy about using that leverage for personal gratification. Tonight, we'll journey through fog-shrouded monasteries where monks openly kept concubines, visit papal courts where cardinals auctioned off positions to fund their lavish lifestyles, and explore village churches where local priests accumulated unofficial wives like medieval Pokemon cards. We'll examine how celibacy, originally intended to prevent church property from being inherited by clergy children, became the church's most flagrantly ignored rule. The documents don't lie, and neither do the countless children born to supposedly celibate priests. The legal records of ecclesiastical courts dealing with sexual misconduct, or the reform movements that emerged specifically to address what contemporaries called the crisis of clerical morality. This isn't about attacking religion or faith itself. This is about understanding how power corrupts, how institutions can lose their way, and how human nature consistently finds ways to circumvent even the most sacred rules. The medieval church's sexual scandals weren't anomalies. They were features of a system that incentivized the very behaviors it publicly condemned. So settle in for a journey that will take us from the marble halls of the Vatican to the cramped quarters of rural monasteries, from the bedchambers of popes to the confession booths where the line between spiritual guidance and sexual predation became dangerously blurred. Tonight, we're pulling back the holy veil to reveal the most systematically corrupt period in Christian history. The story you're about to hear isn't found in your typical church history books. It's hidden in legal documents, buried in satirical literature, coded in reformist writings, and scattered across centuries of testimony from victims. Witnesses and occasionally from the perpetrators themselves who were shameless enough to document their own misconduct. Are you ready to discover why the medieval period earned its reputation as the era when the church forgot its own teachings? Let's begin this uncomfortable but necessary journey into the shadows of sacred history. The celibacy lie. You wake up in medieval Europe, and the first thing you need to understand is that everything you've been told about priestly celibacy is a massive historical fabrication. The rule of celibacy wasn't established until 1139 CE at the Second Lateran Council, and even then, it was implemented not for spiritual purity, but for cold, hard economics. The church was hemorrhaging property to the wives and children of priests, and Pope Innocent II decided that the solution wasn't better priests. It was no legal families. But here's the kicker. Nobody cared. The celibacy decree was treated with about as much seriousness as a modern parking ticket. Priests continued living with their wives, whom they now called housekeepers or nieces, and fathering children they claimed were nephews and spiritual sons. The semantic gymnastics were so elaborate that entire dictionaries could be written about. Ecclesiastical euphemisms for sexual relationships. Walk into any monastery in 12th century France, and you'd find what historians euphemistically call double monasteries. Male and female religious communities living suspiciously close together. The Abbey of Fontevraud, for instance, was governed by an abbess who oversaw both monks and nuns, leading to arrangements that would make modern HR departments hyperventilate. Sexual relationships between supposedly celibate religious were so common that specific terms were coined. Spiritual marriage for long-term relationships and occasional friendship for casual encounters. The documentation is overwhelming. In England, Bishop Geoffrey of York, yes, a bishop, was openly living with his concubine and their children as late as 1190. Church records from Canterbury reveal that over 60% of priests in Kent were either married or maintaining long-term sexual relationships. These weren't secret affairs. They were public arrangements that everyone, including church authorities, tacitly accepted. Italian monasteries were particularly notorious. The monastery of Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome was investigated in 1215 after neighbors complained about the constant traffic of women entering and leaving at all hours. The investigating papal legate discovered that monks were charging admission to what they called spiritual counseling sessions. That lasted mysteriously long periods and occurred exclusively in private chambers. The economic implications were staggering. Church records from the 13th century show that monasteries were spending enormous sums on what they euphemistically called domestic arrangements. The monastery of Saint Denis near Paris allocated nearly 30% of its budget to household expenses, which included payments to women officially listed as laundresses, but who lived in monk quarters and bore children with suspiciously ecclesiastical names. German chronicles provide even more explicit evidence. The Chronicle of Thietmar of Merseburg describes visiting a monastery where he counted 12 women living openly with supposedly celibate monks, and where the abbot's spiritual daughter was clearly his biological child. The chronicler notes this with matter-of-fact casualness, suggesting such arrangements were unremarkable. Spanish church documents reveal an entire shadow economy built around clerical sexual relationships. Priests would pay what were called cradle taxes to bishops, essentially bribes to overlook their children. The going rate in 14th century Castile was approximately 3 silver pieces per child per year, making fatherhood a renewable expense rather than a career-ending scandal. The semantic creativity was boundless. Church Latin developed an entire vocabulary for circumventing celibacy rules. Focaria technically meant firekeeper, but universally referred to a priest's live-in sexual partner. Spiritual sons were biological children. Nieces were girlfriends. Housekeepers were wives in all but name. The church created its own elaborate code language to maintain plausible deniability, while enabling systematic rule-breaking. Papal attitudes were equally hypocritical. Pope Alexander II issued stern condemnations of clerical marriage, while simultaneously acknowledging his own illegitimate children in official documents. Pope Innocent IV denounced sexual impropriety among clergy while maintaining a household that included multiple women bearing children with papal features. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that it became institutionalized. Canon law developed elaborate procedures for handling clerical families. Rather than enforcing celibacy, church courts created legal frameworks for managing the children and partners of supposedly celibate priests. Inheritance laws were rewritten not to prevent clerical families, but to ensure that church property remained under ecclesiastical control, despite the existence of those families. The scale of noncompliance was breathtaking. A survey of English dioceses in 1222 revealed that fewer than 15% of priests were actually celibate. The remaining 85% were either married, maintaining long-term relationships, or engaging in what church documents delicately termed irregular domestic arrangements. This wasn't failure of enforcement. It was institutional acquiescence disguised as moral authority. Reform movements emerged specifically to address what was called the Great Pretense. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century spent decades trying to enforce celibacy, but succeeded only in driving clerical relationships underground and creating elaborate systems of deception. Instead of eliminating sexual relationships among clergy, the Reform movement merely forced them to become more creative about concealment. By the 13th century, the fiction of celibacy had become so elaborate that entire legal subcategories existed for managing the families of celibate priests. Church courts routinely processed inheritance disputes involving the children of supposedly childless clergy, handled domestic disputes between priests and their unofficial wives, and mediated property claims involving women who were legally non-existent, but practically indispensable. The hypocrisy reached its peak when the church began taxing clerical relationships. Rather than preventing them, bishops instituted fees that effectively legalized what was theoretically forbidden. Priests could maintain families by paying annual domestic charges to their superiors, creating a revenue stream that made clerical celibacy violations profitable for the institutional church. This wasn't just about sex. It was about power, money, and the fundamental dishonesty that would characterize medieval Christianity for centuries. The celibacy lie was perhaps the Church's first great systematic deception, setting the precedent for the elaborate moral compromises that would define the next 400 years of ecclesiastical history. Papal orgies and Vatican brothels. You're standing in the Vatican in 1501, and the sounds coming from the papal apartments would make a Roman brothel owner blush. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, isn't just breaking the rules of celibacy. He's hosting what contemporaries called the most elaborate sexual festivals in Christian history. The papal palace has been transformed into something that would make Caligula seem conservative, and the head of the Catholic Church is personally orchestrating orgies that involve cardinals, courtesans, and enough creative debauchery to scandalize Renaissance Italy. The banquet of chestnuts, held on October 30th, 1501, stands as perhaps the most documented papal orgy in history. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies and a German priest known for his meticulous record-keeping, documented the event in his official diary. According to his detailed account, 50 Roman courtesans were invited to dine with the Pope, several cardinals, and Cesare Borgia in the papal apartments. After dinner, the women danced naked, crawling on hands and knees to pick up chestnuts scattered on the floor while the clergy watched and offered running commentary. But the evening was just beginning. Burchard's diary, written in Latin and preserved in Vatican archives, describes how prizes were offered for the men who could achieve the most sexual encounters with the courtesans. The Pope himself served as judge, keeping score and distributing rewards that included church positions, land grants, and bags of gold coins. Cardinals were photographed, while The medieval equivalent was detailed written testimony, engaging in acts that would have been criminal in any other context, but were apparently considered entertainment when conducted under papal supervision. This wasn't an isolated incident. Burchard's diaries, spanning Alexander VI's entire papacy, document regular sexual entertainments in the Vatican. Wednesday evenings were apparently reserved for what were euphemistically called spiritual recreation, which involved high-ranking clergy and selected Roman prostitutes engaging in elaborate sexual performances for the Pope's amusement. The papal chamberlain maintained detailed guest lists, suggesting these events were planned with the same care as diplomatic receptions. The logistics alone were staggering. Vatican financial records from Alexander VI's reign show regular payments to what were officially listed as domestic entertainers, but were clearly prostitutes. The papal household employed a staff position called Supervisor of Pleasures, whose job was coordinating these events. Room modifications in the papal apartments included the installation of padded floors, the removal of religious iconography from specific chambers, and the construction of discreet entrances for guests who preferred not to be seen entering through main Vatican corridors. Alexander V's sexual appetite wasn't limited to organized events. He maintained what amounted to a papal harem, with official mistresses receiving salaries from the papal treasury. Benazid de Catanei, his primary long-term partner, was granted enormous estates and bore him 4 acknowledged children, including Cesare and Lucretia Borgia. But she was just the most prominent of numerous women who received papal patronage in exchange for sexual services. The children of Alexander VI weren't hidden. They were integrated into papal administration. Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal at age 17, despite having no theological training and showing no interest in religious matters beyond their utility for political advancement. Lucretia Borgia was married off multiple times to secure political alliances, with her father personally negotiating the terms of marriages that were essentially international prostitution arrangements disguised as diplomacy. Vatican financial records reveal the enormous cost of papal sexual entertainment. During Alexander VI's 11-year reign, approximately 12% of papal revenues were allocated to what treasury documents called domestic hospitality, a category that included payments to prostitutes, renovations to accommodate sexual activities, and gifts to the numerous women bearing papal children. The amount spent on sexual entertainment exceeded the Vatican's expenditure on charitable works by a ratio of nearly 4-to-1. The papal apartments were essentially redesigned to accommodate sexual activities. Architectural modifications included soundproofing of private chambers, the installation of multiple bedrooms connected by private corridors, and the construction of a bathhouse complex that visitors described as surpassing anything in ancient Rome for decadent luxury. Venetian ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing chambers decorated with explicitly sexual artwork and furnished with devices that they could only describe in coded, diplomatic language. Other papal staff members were expected to participate in or facilitate these activities. Cardinals who wanted to maintain their positions learned to provide attractive companions for papal entertainment. The College of Cardinals effectively became a procuring organization, with church officials competing to provide the most creative sexual diversions for papal approval. Advancement in church hierarchy became directly tied to one's ability to organize elaborate sexual entertainment. The international implications were enormous. Foreign ambassadors were routinely presented with sexual favors as part of diplomatic protocols. The French ambassador to the Vatican wrote extensively about being offered spiritual companionship that was clearly prostitution, while the Spanish court received detailed reports about papal sexual activities that influenced international relations. European courts began factoring papal sexual preferences into their diplomatic strategies. Alexander VI's successors attempted to distance themselves from his excesses, but the institutional damage was irreversible. The papal court had established sexual entertainment as standard practice. creating expectations among Vatican staff and visiting dignitaries that took decades to eliminate. Julius II, Alexander VI's successor, spent significant time and resources trying to restore some semblance of dignity to papal administration. But the reputation of the papal court as a center of sexual debauchery persisted throughout the 16th century. The documentation of papal sexual activities is overwhelming because it was so normalized that people wrote about it matter-of-factly. Church records, diplomatic correspondence, contemporary chronicles, and financial documents all contain casual references to papal sexual attainment as routine administrative matters. The Vatican Library contains hundreds of documents from this period that treat papal orgies with the same bureaucratic tone used for recording grain purchases or diplomatic meetings. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the sexual activities themselves, but the systematic way they were integrated into church administration. Sexual favors became currency in papal politics. Church positions were literally purchased with sexual services. Women were essentially sold into papal harems through arrangements disguised as religious appointments. The entire Vatican had become a sophisticated prostitution ring operated by the supposed spiritual leader of Catholicism. This wasn't just about one corrupt pope. It was about an institutional system that had become so divorced from its stated values that the most sacred spaces in Christianity were converted into elaborate brothels. The papal court of Alexander VI represents the absolute nadir of church moral authority, but it was the logical conclusion of centuries of systematic corruption that treated religious leadership as an opportunity for personal gratification rather than spiritual responsibility. The monastery breeding grounds, you step into the monastery of Cluny in 1187, and immediately you notice something that doesn't match the popular image of austere religious life. The sounds coming from the dormitories aren't prayers. They're the unmistakable noises of sexual activity. The cells designed for individual contemplation have been modified with connecting doors. And the number of servant women employed by the monastery somehow exceeds the number of monks by a ratio of 3-to-1. This isn't a religious community. It's a medieval breeding ground disguised as a holy sanctuary. The architecture tells the story that official histories try to hide. Monastery layouts from the 12th and 13th centuries show systematic modifications to accommodate sexual activities. Private chambers were connected by discrete corridors. Bathhouses were constructed with capacity far exceeding monastic needs. And separate quarters were built for women who were officially employed as laundresses, cooks, and cleaners, but whose actual functions were considerably more intimate. The Abbey of St. Denis near Paris contains architectural modifications that include soundproof chambers and hidden passages connecting the monks' quarters to women's accommodations. Financial records provide damning evidence of systematic sexual commerce within monastic walls. The monastery of Santa Maria in Florence allocated 43% of its annual budget to what were euphemistically called domestic services. These included payments to women officially listed as household staff, but whose salaries exceeded those of skilled craftsmen, suggesting their services went well beyond cooking and cleaning. Detailed accounting ledgers show regular payments for what were coded as spiritual counseling materials, items that included silk bedding, expensive wines, and imported perfumes that had no apparent connection to religious contemplation. The famous monasteries of medieval Europe functioned as sophisticated sexual enterprises. The Abbey of Fontevraud, which housed both male and female religious communities, developed elaborate systems for managing sexual relationships between supposedly celibate residents. Rooms were assigned based on compatibility rather than religious rank, and the abbey's rules included detailed protocols for what were called spiritual partnerships, long-term sexual relationships disguised as religious collaborations. German monasteries were particularly notorious for their creative interpretations of celibacy. The monastery of Fulda employed over 200 women as spiritual assistants, a position that required no religious training but apparently demanded very specific physical qualifications. Visitation records from ecclesiastical inspectors describe living arrangements that resembled medieval harems more than religious communities. Monks maintained private apartments with their chosen companions, and children born within monastery walls were so common that special nursery facilities were constructed and staffed with wet nurses. The breeding was literal, not metaphorical. Monastery records from across medieval Europe document thousands of children born to supposedly celibate monks. These children weren't accidents. They were integral to monastic economic systems. Boys born in monasteries were automatically enrolled as novices, providing free labor and ensuring the continuation of monastic communities. Girls were employed as servants or married off to create economic alliances with local families. The monasteries had essentially created self-perpetuating populations through systematic sexual reproduction. English monasteries developed particularly sophisticated systems for managing their breeding programs. The Monastery of Glastonbury maintained detailed genealogical records, tracking the lineages of monk fathers and their multiple offspring. Children were classified according to their fathers' positions within the monastic hierarchy, with the abbot's children receiving preferential treatment in education and eventual placement within church institutions. The monastery functioned as both a religious community and a multi-generational family enterprise. The scale of monastic reproduction was staggering. A survey of French monasteries conducted in 1215 by papal legates found that the average monastery housed approximately 47 children, who were biological offspring of supposedly celibate monks. These weren't isolated cases. They represented systematic violations of celibacy that were so normalized that special legal categories were created to handle the inheritance rights of monastic children. Spanish monasteries took the breeding concept to its logical extreme by establishing what were essentially monastic dynasties. The monastery of San Juan de la Pina maintained family trees spanning multiple generations, with positions of authority passing from monk fathers to their sons in clear violation of church law. Abbots routinely appointed their biological children to key administrative positions, creating hereditary religious leadership that made a mockery of monastic principles. The women involved in these arrangements weren't volunteers. They were often economic captives trapped in systems of institutionalized sexual exploitation. Monastery records describe women who were donated to religious communities by families seeking economic advancement or debt forgiveness. These women became the property of monasteries, forced to provide sexual services to monks while being denied any legal rights or protections. Their children were similarly owned by the monastic community, creating generations of people born into religious sexual slavery. The theological justifications were elaborate and creative. Monks developed entire philosophical frameworks for reconciling their sexual activities with their religious vows. Spiritual marriage was redefined to include physical consummation as a form of religious ecstasy. Children born to monks were classified as gifts from God, rather than violations of celibacy. Sexual relationships were reframed as spiritual partnerships, necessary for achieving higher levels of religious understanding. Monastic libraries contain extensive collections of erotic literature disguised as religious texts. Illuminated manuscripts from monastery scriptoriums include explicitly sexual imagery incorporated into religious scenes. The famous Book of Hours from the Abbey of St. Martial contains marginal illustrations that are essentially medieval pornography. These weren't accidents or corruptions. They were systematic integration of sexual content into religious materials, suggesting that monasteries saw no contradiction between spiritual devotion and sexual expression. The breeding programs created complex social hierarchies within monastic communities. Monks who fathered the most children gained higher status, as reproduction was seen as evidence of divine favor. Women who bore sons were rewarded with better living conditions and increased influence within monastery administration. Children were ranked according to their perceived intelligence and physical attractiveness, with the most promising offspring receiving advanced education and preparation for leadership roles. Reform movements specifically targeted monastic breeding programs, but their efforts were largely ineffective because the economic incentives were too powerful. Monasteries generated enormous revenues from their sexual enterprises, selling children as servants, arranging marriages for profit, and charging fees for sexual services. The reform efforts merely drove these activities underground and made them more sophisticated rather than eliminating them. The long-term consequences were catastrophic for church moral authority. Entire regions developed populations where monastery-born children formed significant demographics. The genetic impact of systematic monastic breeding created identifiable bloodlines that persisted for centuries. By the late medieval period, some rural areas had populations where nearly 20% of residents could trace their ancestry to supposedly celibate monks. This wasn't just about individual misconduct. It was about institutional systems that had transformed religious communities into breeding operations. The monasteries of medieval Europe weren't havens of spiritual contemplation. They were sophisticated sexual enterprises that used religious authority to exploit women, produce children for economic advantage, and create hereditary systems of power that completely subverted the principles they claimed to represent. Village priests and their unofficial wives. You walk into the village church of Saint Pierre in rural Normandy, circa 1240, and the scene before you would shatter every Sunday school image you've ever held. Father Guillaume isn't alone at the altar. He's flanked by Marguerite, whom everyone knows as his wife, but who's officially listed in church records as his housekeeper. Their 3 children are serving as altar boys, and the entire congregation treats this arrangement as perfectly normal. Welcome to medieval parish life, where celibacy was a theoretical concept and family life was the practical reality. The documentation is overwhelming and comes from the most unexpected source: the church's own records. Parish registers from across medieval Europe meticulously document the families of supposedly celibate priests. In England alone, church archives contain over 12,000 entries for children, officially classified as nephews and spiritual daughters of priests, euphemisms that fooled no one and weren't intended to. These weren't secret relationships hidden from parishioners. They were public arrangements that everyone acknowledged while maintaining elaborate linguistic fictions. The economics of clerical families created entire shadow systems within parish administration. Village priests typically maintained what church documents called domestic households that required substantial financial support. Church financial records from 13th century France show that the average parish allocated nearly 35% of its revenues to supporting the priest's extended spiritual family. These expenditures included housing, food, clothing, and education for women and children who had no official existence within church hierarchy, but were essential to parish operations. The arrangements were remarkably sophisticated and varied according to local customs and economic conditions. In wealthy parishes, priests maintained elaborate households that resembled minor nobility. The priest of St. Martin in Tours lived in a mansion with his wife and 7 children, employed a staff of 12 servants, and hosted regular social gatherings that were indistinguishable from aristocratic entertainments. Church records show that his household expenses exceeded the total charitable expenditures of his parish by a factor of 6 to 1. German villages developed particularly creative solutions to the celibacy problem. The practice of spiritual marriage became so common that specific legal frameworks emerged to handle the property rights of priests' families. Church courts routinely processed inheritance disputes involving the widows and children of supposedly celibate clergy. The German term Pfaffenweib, priest's wife, entered common usage and appeared in official legal documents, suggesting that these relationships were legally recognized despite their theoretical impossibility. Italian parishes took the family concept even further by creating dynastic systems of religious leadership. The parish of San Lorenzo in Florence was controlled by the Benedetti family for over 2 centuries, with the position of priest passing from father to son through carefully managed theological educations and strategic appointments. Church records show that the Benedetti priests married into prominent local families, accumulated substantial property holdings, and operated the parish as a hereditary business enterprise. The women in these arrangements occupied a peculiar social position that combined significant local influence with complete legal invisibility. Parish housekeepers often wielded more practical authority than officially appointed church administrators. They managed church finances, organized community events, and served as intermediaries between priests and parishioners. Many were educated women who handled correspondence, maintained records, and essentially functioned as parish administrators while receiving no official recognition for their roles. Spanish villages developed elaborate systems for managing clerical families that were so sophisticated they required specialized legal expertise. The practice of barragania, formal concubinage for clergy, became so widespread that canon lawyers created detailed protocols for handling the property rights, inheritance claims, and social status of priests' unofficial families. These legal frameworks treated clerical relationships as marriages in all but name, providing the women and children with substantial protections and privileges. The children of village priests occupied unique positions within medieval society. They received excellent educations, often surpassing those available to children of minor nobility. Many became priests themselves, creating hereditary religious dynasties that controlled parish resources for generations. Others entered secular professions with advantages gained through their father's ecclesiastical connections. Church records show that priests' children had significantly higher literacy rates and career advancement opportunities compared to other rural populations. The theological justifications developed by village priests were remarkably creative. Local religious leaders argued that spiritual leadership required deep understanding of human relationships, which could only be achieved through personal experience of marriage and family life. Some claimed that celibacy was a papal invention not supported by Scripture, pointing to married priests in early Christianity and the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Others developed elaborate theories about spiritual marriage that allowed physical relationships while maintaining technical adherence to celibacy vows. Parish communities actively supported these arrangements because they provided stability and continuity that purely celibate priests could not offer. Families with established local roots were less likely to be transferred to other parishes, ensuring consistent religious leadership. The priests' wives often provided valuable services to the community, including midwifery, medical care, and education for local children. These arrangements created integrated support systems that benefited entire villages. The scale of the phenomenon is documented in visitation records from ecclesiastical inspectors. A survey of English parishes in 1222 found that over 80% of rural priests were maintaining long-term relationships with women, and approximately 60% had acknowledged children. These weren't hidden affairs discovered through investigation. They were open arrangements that inspectors documented as routine administrative matters. The reports treat clerical families with the same matter-of-fact tone used for recording church property or financial accounts. Reform movements repeatedly attempted to enforce celibacy in rural parishes, but their efforts were consistently undermined by practical realities. Bishops who tried to remove married priests faced resistance from entire communities that depended on the stability provided by clerical families. Replacement priests sent to enforce celibacy often adopted the same practices within months of their arrival, suggesting that the system was driven by practical necessities rather than moral failures. The most telling evidence comes from the legal documents created to manage clerical family disputes. Church courts developed extensive case law dealing with inheritance claims by priest children, property disputes involving priests' widows, and custody battles when relationships ended. These legal frameworks treated clerical families as legitimate entities requiring protection and regulation, completely contradicting the theoretical non-existence of such relationships. Economic records revealed that many village priests accumulated substantial wealth through their family connections. Marriage alliances with local merchant families provided access to commercial opportunities, while their children's marriages created networks of influence that extended far beyond parish boundaries. Some priestly families became significant landowners and business operators, using their religious positions as foundations for multi-generational economic enterprises. The corruption wasn't just about individual priests breaking vows. It was about entire communities collaborating in elaborate deceptions that made a mockery of church authority. Village parishes had created alternative systems of religious leadership that prioritized practical effectiveness over theological purity. These systems worked well for local communities, but represented fundamental challenges to centralized church control and moral authority. By the late medieval period, the gap between official church teaching and parish reality had become so enormous that it created parallel religious systems. Official Catholicism preached celibacy, while practical Catholicism operated through family-based religious leadership. This division would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation, as reformers pointed to clerical marriage as evidence of Catholic institutional corruption and hypocrisy. The economics of ecclesiastical prostitution. You're examining the account books of the Diocese of Reims in 1289, and the numbers tell a story that would make medieval accountants blush if they weren't so busy calculating profits from what amounted to the largest prostitution ring in European history. The Catholic Church hadn't just tolerated sexual commerce. It had systematized, taxed, and profited from it on a scale that dwarfed any secular enterprise. What you're looking at isn't just financial records. It's evidence of an institution that had transformed moral authority into sexual currency and spiritual leadership into economic exploitation. The mathematics are staggering and meticulously documented. Diocesan records from across medieval Europe show that church revenues from what were euphemistically called domestic arrangements typically constituted between 15 and 30% of total ecclesiastical income. In the wealthy diocese of Avignon, sexual commerce generated more revenue than tithing, land rents, and indulgence sales combined. The church had accidentally discovered that sex was more profitable than salvation, and it had structured entire administrative systems around maximizing these returns. The taxation systems were elaborate and sophisticated, requiring specialized bureaucracies to manage their collection and distribution. Bishops employed officials with titles like Supervisor of Domestic Affairs and Administrator of Household Arrangements, whose actual job was managing the church's prostitution economy. These positions required detailed knowledge of canon law, accounting practices, and what might charitably be called personnel management, skills that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with running profitable sexual enterprises. French church archives contain detailed pricing schedules for different categories of sexual services provided by and to clergy. The tariffs of spiritual comfort established standardized rates based on the rank of the religious figure involved, the duration of the arrangement, and the specific services required. A village priest could maintain a long-term relationship for approximately 12 silver pieces annually, while a bishop's spiritual companion commanded fees equivalent to a skilled craftsman's yearly wage. Cardinals and abbots paid premium rates that supported women in luxury comparable to minor nobility. The supply chains were international and sophisticatedly managed. Convents across Europe functioned as training centers for women, who would eventually serve in various capacities within the ecclesiastical sexual economy. Young women entered these institutions ostensibly for religious education, but received instruction in languages, music, literature, and what church records euphemistically called interpersonal ministry skills. The most promising graduates were recruited for positions in wealthy dioceses or monastery administrations. creating a pipeline of educated women whose actual function was providing sexual services to high-ranking clergy. Italian church documents reveal the existence of specialized recruitment networks that operated across national boundaries. The orders of spiritual companionship were pseudo-religious organizations that identified, trained, and placed women in ecclesiastical households throughout Europe. These operations were so sophisticated that they maintained quality control standards, performance evaluations, and career advancement opportunities for their members. The most successful women could progress from serving village priests to managing household operations for cardinals or even papal administrators. The financial instruments created to manage ecclesiastical sexual commerce were innovative and complex. Church banks developed specialized lending products for clergy seeking to establish or upgrade their domestic arrangements. The spiritual household loan was a financial product specifically designed to help priests acquire better housing, furnishings, and companions appropriate to their ecclesiastical rank. Interest rates were structured to encourage long-term relationships over temporary arrangements, as stable partnerships generated more predictable revenue streams for church administrations. Spanish church archives document elaborate insurance systems designed to protect the investments made in ecclesiastical sexual arrangements. The Domestic Security Fund provided financial protection for women who became pregnant by priests, ensuring continued support during periods when their services might be temporarily unavailable. These funds also covered the costs of raising and educating the children born from clerical relationships, treating offspring as long-term investments rather than unwanted complications. The scale of child production from ecclesiastical sexual arrangements created entire secondary economies. Church-operated orphanages and schools were largely populated by the children of supposedly celibate priests. These institutions functioned as training centers for future church employees, ensuring that the next generation would be equipped to continue the systems their fathers had established. Boys received education appropriate for eventual religious careers, while girls were prepared for roles within ecclesiastical household management. German dioceses developed particularly sophisticated systems for managing the inheritance rights of clerical children. The Spiritual Legacy Protocol was a legal framework that allowed the property accumulated through ecclesiastical careers to be passed to biological children while maintaining the fiction of celibacy. These protocols were so elaborate that they required specialized legal expertise and created entire subcategories of canon law focused on managing the estates of supposedly childless priests. The international trade aspects were extensive and well documented. Wealthy prelates imported companions from other countries, creating a luxury market for exotic beauty and sophisticated education. The papal court regularly received women from across Europe as diplomatic gifts, with their services treated as valuable commodities in international relations. Ambassadors reported that successful negotiations often depended on providing appropriate feminine entertainment for high-ranking church officials. The technological innovations were remarkable for their time period. Churches invested in architectural modifications specifically designed to accommodate and conceal sexual activities. Hidden passages, soundproof chambers, and discreet entrances became standard features of ecclesiastical construction. The Abbey of Saint-Germain in Paris contained a network of tunnels connecting various buildings, allowing for movement of women and children without public observation. These construction projects were funded through regular church budgets and documented in official architectural records. The marketing strategies employed by church administrators were sophisticated and effective. Different dioceses competed to attract the most talented and attractive women for their ecclesiastical households. Recruitment materials emphasized career advancement opportunities, educational benefits, and social status improvements available through positions in church administration. The most successful recruitment campaigns promised travel opportunities, cultural exposure, and connections to influential networks across European society. Quality control systems ensured that standards were maintained across the ecclesiastical sexual economy. Regular inspections evaluated the performance of women in various church positions, with detailed reports filed regarding their appearance, demeanor, education level, and effectiveness in their assigned roles. Poor performers were reassigned to less prestigious positions, while exceptional employees were promoted to more influential diocese or monastery administrations. The training programs were comprehensive and professionally managed. Church-sponsored schools provided instruction in languages, music, literature, etiquette, and what were euphemistically called counseling techniques. Graduates received certifications that were recognized across European ecclesiastical administrations, creating professional credentials for careers that officially didn't exist but practically dominated church personnel management. The pension systems were surprisingly generous and well-funded. Women who had served in ecclesiastical households received retirement benefits that often exceeded those available to secular employees. The spiritual service pension provided lifetime support for women who had completed minimum service requirements, ensuring their loyalty and discretion while protecting the church's investment in their training and development. This wasn't just widespread corruption. It was systematic, economic restructuring that had transformed the Catholic Church into the largest sexual commerce enterprise in medieval Europe. The institution that claimed moral authority over all of Christendom had become the primary exploiter of women and children, generating enormous profits through the systematic violation of its own principles while maintaining elaborate deceptions about its actual operations. Confession booth predators. You kneel in the confession booth of Notre Dame de Paris in 1284, and what happens next would redefine your understanding of spiritual guidance forever. The wooden partition that's supposed to provide sacred privacy has become a tool for predatory manipulation. And the priest who claims to represent divine forgiveness is using your deepest secrets as leverage for sexual exploitation. Welcome to perhaps the most insidious abuse system ever created by organized religion, the transformation of spiritual vulnerability into sexual opportunity. The confession booth was architectural innovation that accidentally created the perfect environment for systematic sexual abuse. The design that was intended to provide privacy for spiritual conversations instead created isolated spaces where power dynamics were absolutely skewed and victims were completely vulnerable. Church records from the 13th and 14th centuries document thousands of cases where confession was used as the first step in elaborate grooming processes that would culminate in sexual assault. The theological manipulation was sophisticated and psychologically devastating. Priests had access to the most intimate details of people's lives, including their sexual thoughts, marital problems, and personal insecurities. This information became weaponry for manipulation, as priests could identify the most vulnerable individuals and exploit their specific psychological weaknesses. Canon law gave priests enormous authority over penitents' spiritual lives, and this authority was routinely leveraged for sexual gratification. French church archives contain detailed accounts of confession-related sexual abuse that were documented because they involved prominent families whose complaints couldn't be ignored. The case of Marguerite de Montfort, wife of a minor nobleman, illustrates the typical pattern. Her confession of marital difficulties led to extended private counseling sessions, then requests for additional meetings outside the confession booth, and finally explicit sexual demands presented as spiritual exercises necessary for her salvation. The isolation was intentional and carefully constructed. Confession booths were deliberately positioned in areas of churches that provided minimal oversight while maintaining the appearance of sacred legitimacy. Many churches had multiple confession areas, allowing priests to select the most secluded locations for targeting specific victims. The acoustic properties were designed to prevent conversations from being overheard, but this privacy protection became a shield for predatory behavior. Italian church documents reveal systematic patterns of confession abuse that were so widespread they required specialized administrative responses. Bishops routinely processed complaints about priests who used confession as a recruitment tool for sexual encounters. Rather than removing these priests, church administrators developed protocols for managing the complaints while protecting the priests from secular legal consequences. The typical response was to transfer abusive priests to new parishes where their histories were unknown. The psychological manipulation techniques were refined over centuries of practice. Priests learned to identify penitents who were experiencing marital problems, sexual frustration, or emotional distress, then position themselves as the solution to these problems. The confession of sexual thoughts or desires was reframed as evidence of special spiritual needs that required intensive personal guidance from the priest. This guidance inevitably involved increasing levels of physical intimacy, presented as therapeutic or spiritually necessary. German church records document the development of specialized confectuses that were essentially grooming protocols disguised as religious innovations. The extended spiritual consultation was a procedure that began with normal confession, but evolved into private meetings where priests provided increasingly intimate counseling. These sessions were scheduled outside normal church hours and conducted in private chambers rather than public confession areas, creating optimal conditions for sexual abuse. The targeting was systematic and strategic. Church documents reveal that priests specifically sought out women who were socially isolated, economically dependent, or experiencing personal crises that made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Widows, women in troubled marriages, and those experiencing financial difficulties were disproportionately represented among confession abuse victims. The priests had effectively weaponized spiritual authority to exploit human suffering. Spanish church archives contain evidence of confession abuse networks, where priests shared information about particularly vulnerable parishioners. The spiritual guidance correspondence was a communication system that allowed priests to exchange details about women who might be receptive to sexual advances, disguised as religious counseling. These networks ensured that women who rejected one priest's advances might be targeted by others, using refined approaches based on shared intelligence. The theological justifications were elaborate and blasphemous. Priests developed entire philosophical frameworks for presenting sexual abuse as spiritual healing. Physical intimacy was reframed as a form of prayer. Sexual submission was presented as religious obedience, and resistance to abuse was characterized as spiritual weakness or demonic influence. These theological perversions were sophisticated enough to convince victims that their abuse was actually evidence of divine favor. The documentation exists because some victims had sufficient social status to demand investigations when abuse occurred. Church archives contain detailed testimonies from women who described identical patterns of manipulation across different parishes and time periods. The consistency of these accounts reveals that confession abuse techniques were being systematically taught and refined throughout ecclesiastical hierarchy. English church records show that confession abuse was so common that specific legal procedures were developed to handle the complaints. Rather than treating these cases as criminal matters, church courts processed them as administrative disputes involving inappropriate pastoral counseling. The punishments were typically minor, temporary suspension, prayer requirements, or transfer to different parishes, suggesting that church hierarchy viewed confession abuse as a manageable personnel problem rather than serious criminal behavior. The most disturbing evidence comes from instructional materials found in monastery libraries. Medieval texts on confession techniques include detailed guidance on identifying vulnerable penitents and developing intimate relationships with them. These materials were disguised as theological education, but were essentially training manuals for sexual predators. The existence of such materials indicates that confession abuse was not only tolerated but actively taught as an acceptable practice. The scale of victimization was enormous because confession was a required sacrament that provided regular access to potential victims. Every adult Catholic was required to confess at least annually, creating a system where millions of people were required to place themselves in vulnerable positions with men who had been trained to exploit that vulnerability. The mandatory nature of confession meant that avoidance wasn't an option for practicing Catholics. The long-term psychological damage was catastrophic and well documented in contemporary sources. Victims of confession abuse frequently developed what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma disorders. Many abandoned religious practice entirely, while others became obsessively religious in attempts to regain spiritual purity they believed had been lost through abuse. The damage extended beyond individual victims to undermine trust in religious authority throughout medieval society. The cover-up systems were sophisticated and effective. Church administrators developed protocols for managing abuse, complaints that prioritized institutional protection over victim welfare. Standard procedures included discrediting victims' testimonies, transferring abusive priests to locations where they could continue predatory behavior, and using theological arguments to discourage victims from pursuing complaints through secular legal systems. Reform movements repeatedly attempted to address confession abuse, but their efforts were undermined by the structural problems inherent in the system itself. The combination of mandatory participation, absolute privacy, and enormous power imbalances created conditions that were inherently vulnerable to abuse. Proposed reforms typically focused on training priests to recognize inappropriate behavior rather than addressing the systemic problems that enabled abuse in the first place. This wasn't just about individual priests committing crimes. It was about an institutional system that had transformed the most sacred religious practices into opportunities for sexual exploitation. The confession booth became a symbol of Catholic spiritual authority, but the reality was that it functioned as hunting ground for predators who used theological manipulation to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. Children as currency. You're standing in the Cathedral School of Chartres in 1267, watching a transaction that would horrify any modern observer, but was routine business in medieval church administration. 8-year-old peers being handed over to Bishop Guillaume by his parents, who believe they're securing their son's spiritual education and future prosperity. What they don't realize is that they've just delivered their child into a system that routinely trafficked minors for sexual exploitation, used children as economic assets, and treated young bodies as currency in a marketplace where innocence was the most valuable commodity. The scale of child trafficking within medieval church institutions was staggering and meticulously documented in administrative records that treated human children like livestock inventories. Cathedral schools, monastery orphanages, and religious training centers across Europe housed tens of thousands of children who had been separated from their families through arrangements that were technically legal but practically indistinguishable from slavery. Church archives contain detailed records of child transfers, including ages, physical descriptions, and assigned monetary values that reveal the systematic commodification of young lives. The procurement systems were sophisticated and operated across international boundaries. The oblation system allowed parents to donate children to religious institutions in exchange for spiritual benefits, debt forgiveness, or promises of advancement for the children themselves. However, church records reveal that many of these children were immediately redistributed to other institutions, based on their perceived value in various capacities. The most attractive children were reserved for personal service to high-ranking clergy, while others were assigned to general labor or eventually sold to secular households. French church documents contain pricing schedules for children that varied based on age, appearance, and perceived intelligence. Boys between ages 8 and 12 commanded premium prices because they were considered ideal for personal service roles that combined domestic labor with sexual availability. Girls of similar ages were valued slightly lower, but were often reserved for longer-term arrangements that would eventually transition them into adult roles within ecclesiastical households. The The pricing was standardized across regions, indicating coordinated trafficking networks. The trafficking routes were well established and regularly utilized by church administrators seeking to acquire children with specific characteristics. Italian monasteries were known for producing children with advanced musical training. German institutions specialized in those with scribal skills. And Spanish centers were recognized for providing children trained in household management. These specialized training programs were essentially production systems, designed to increase the market value of trafficked children. English church records document elaborate schemes for acquiring children from economically desperate families. The spiritual adoption program promised parents that their children would receive excellent educations and guaranteed positions within church hierarchy. In reality, most children were used for manual labor, personal service, and sexual gratification by clergy. Follow-up records show that fewer than 5% of children entered through these programs actually achieved the promised religious careers. The abuse was systematic and institutionalized rather than opportunistic. Church training manuals contain detailed instructions for managing child populations within religious institutions, including protocols for selecting children for special service roles that were clearly sexual in nature. These materials were disguised as administrative guidance that were essentially handbooks for operating child prostitution rings within religious institutions. German monastery records reveal the existence of specialized positions within ecclesiastical hierarchy devoted entirely to child management. The supervisor of young souls was responsible for evaluating newly arrived children and assigning them to appropriate roles based on their physical characteristics and perceived compliance levels. These evaluations included detailed physical examinations and behavioral assessments that prioritized sexual availability over spiritual development. The psychological conditioning was thorough and professionally implemented. Children were indoctrinated with theological concepts that presented sexual service to clergy as a form of religious devotion. They were taught that resistance to adult demands was sinful, that their bodies belonged to the church rather than themselves, and that sexual abuse was actually evidence of divine favor. This psychological manipulation was so effective that many victims defended their abusers even after reaching adulthood. Spanish church archives document the development of breeding programs designed to produce children specifically for ecclesiastical use. Monasteries and convents maintained populations of women whose primary function was bearing children for church institutions. These children were raised from birth within religious systems and were conditioned from earliest childhood to accept sexual exploitation as normal and expected. The programs were so systematic that detailed genealogical records were maintained to track bloodlines and prevent inbreeding. The economic integration was complete and sophisticated. Church budgets included line items for child acquisition, training, housing, and eventual resale or transfer. The most valuable children were treated as capital investments, with their training and development carefully managed to maximize their long-term economic potential. Detailed financial records show that successful child trafficking operations generated profits that rivaled traditional church revenue sources. Italian church documents reveal international child trading networks that operated with papal authorization. High-ranking clergy exchanged children as diplomatic gifts, with particularly attractive or talented youngsters serving as valuable commodities in international relations. Cardinals routinely presented children to foreign dignitaries as tokens of goodwill, and papal legates used child gifts to secure favorable treatment in international negotiations. The legal frameworks were carefully constructed to provide legitimacy for child trafficking operations. Canon law included provisions that granted church institutions extensive authority over children placed in their care, essentially making it legal for religious organizations to do anything they wished with these young lives. Secular legal systems were largely excluded from church child management practices, creating environments where abuse could occur without legal consequences. The training centers were sophisticated operations that combined legitimate education with systematic abuse preparation. Children received instruction in languages, music, and basic literacy alongside conditioning that prepared them for sexual exploitation. The curriculum was designed to produce children who were sufficiently educated to serve in sophisticated households, while being psychologically prepared to accept abuse without resistance. The distribution networks were international and efficiently managed. Church institutions maintained detailed inventories of available children, including their skills, physical characteristics, and training levels. Regional administrators coordinated transfers based on specific requests from bishops, abbots, and other high-ranking clergy. The most desirable children might be transferred multiple times before settling into permanent positions. The documentation of child abuse within church institutions is overwhelming because administrators treated these activities as routine business matters rather than crimes. Financial records, correspondence between church officials, and administrative reports contain casual references to child sexual exploitation that reveal the complete normalization of practices that would be considered horrifically criminal today. The long-term consequences were catastrophic for the thousands of children who survived these systems. Many developed severe psychological disorders, struggled with substance abuse, and were unable to form healthy adult relationships. Others became perpetrators themselves, continuing cycles of abuse that have been normalized during their formative years. The institutional damage to these young lives created generations of traumatized individuals whose suffering was multiplied through their own damaged relationships. The cover-up systems were sophisticated and effective because child trafficking was integrated into legitimate church administrative systems. Abuse was disguised as education. Exploitation was presented as spiritual development, and trafficking was characterized as charitable child welfare. The institutional legitimacy provided perfect camouflage for criminal operations that destroyed thousands of young lives while generating enormous profits for religious institutions. This wasn't just about individual predators committing crimes against children. It was about systematic institutional child trafficking that operated on an international scale with full knowledge and authorization from the highest levels of church hierarchy. The medieval Catholic Church had transformed childhood innocence into a commodity and created industrial-scale systems for exploiting young lives while maintaining public facades of moral authority and charitable child welfare. The great reformers, who failed, you're witnessing one of history's most spectacular failures of institutional reform, as Pope Gregory VII stands before the assembled clergy in 1074. Proclaiming his determination to enforce celibacy and restore moral purity to the Catholic Church. His passionate speeches about spiritual renewal and ecclesiastical dignity would be inspiring if you didn't know that his reform efforts would not only fail catastrophically, but actually make the sexual corruption worse by driving it underground and forcing it to become more sophisticated, creative, and ultimately more damaging to the institution he was trying to save. The Gregorian reform movement, launched with tremendous fanfare and papal authority, was doomed from the start because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the problem it was trying to solve. Church documents from the period reveal that Gregory VII and his supporters believed they were dealing with individual moral failures that could be corrected through stricter enforcement of existing rules. What they were actually confronting was a systematic economic and social structure that had evolved over centuries and was so deeply integrated into church operations that removing it would have required rebuilding Catholic administration from the ground up. The immediate results of reform efforts were precisely the opposite of what reformers intended. Rather than eliminating sexual relationships among clergy, the new enforcement measures simply forced these relationships to become more secretive and therefore more expensive to maintain. French church records from the post-reform period show that expenditures on domestic arrangements actually increased by an average of 43%, as priests were forced to pay higher fees for discretion and security. The reform movement had inadvertently created a black market for clerical sexual services that was more profitable and more corrupting than the previous open system. Cardinal Peter Damian, one of the most passionate reformers, documented his growing despair as he realized that his efforts were making the problems worse rather than better. His correspondence with other reform leaders reveals a man who had expected resistance from corrupt clergy, but was devastated to discover that the resistance came from entire communities that depended on the economic benefits of the existing system. Village parishes, monastery populations, and even papal administrators actively sabotaged reform efforts because sexual commerce had become integral to their financial survival. The theological arguments developed by reform opponents were sophisticated and intellectually formidable. Rather than simply defending corruption, anti-reform clergy developed elaborate, scriptural and philosophical justifications for clerical marriage that were difficult to refute. They pointed to married priests in early Christianity, cited passages from Paul that seemed to endorse marriage over celibacy, and argued that the Eastern Orthodox tradition proved that clerical marriage was compatible with Christian orthodoxy. These arguments gained widespread support because they addressed practical problems that reform rhetoric ignored. German bishops, who attempted to implement Gregorian reforms, faced organized resistance that bordered on rebellion. The priest revolt of 1077 saw entire dioceses refuse to comply with celibacy requirements, and several reform-minded bishops were physically attacked by their own clergy. Church records describe incidents where reforming bishops were driven from their cathedrals by crowds that included both clergy and lay people who had economic stakes in maintaining existing sexual arrangements. The enforcement mechanisms were inadequate and often counterproductive. Ecclesiastical courts, established to prosecute clerical sexual violations, were overwhelmed by the volume of cases and corrupted by the same financial incentives that had created the original problems. Many judges were themselves maintaining illegal relationships and were easily bribed or blackmailed by defendants. The court system became another venue for sexual commerce rather than a solution to it. English reform efforts revealed the international scope of resistance to change. Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury attempted to enforce papal decrees requiring celibacy, but discovered that clergy who were removed from their positions for sexual violations were immediately hired by bishops in other regions who valued their experience and were willing to overlook their histories. The reform movement had created a mobile workforce of experienced but non-compliant clergy who could easily find employment in less reformed areas. The documentation of reform failures is extensive because reformers initially maintained detailed records of their efforts, expecting to demonstrate progress that never materialized. Cardinal Humbert's reform journals chronicle his transformation from optimistic reformer to cynical observer as he realized that every measure designed to enforce celibacy was being circumvented by increasingly creative violations. His later writings describe a church that had become more dishonest and more corrupt as a direct result of reform efforts. Spanish reform attempts were undermined by economic realities that reformers had failed to consider. Many church institutions depended on revenues generated by sexual commerce to maintain their operations, fund charitable activities, and support their physical infrastructure. When these revenue streams were threatened by reform requirements, many institutions faced financial collapse that would have eliminated their ability to provide any religious services. Local communities often chose corrupt but functional religious leadership over reformed but bankrupt churches. The most damaging consequence of failed reforms was the establishment of systematic deception as standard operating procedure within church administration. Rather than eliminating problematic behaviors, reform movements had simply forced them to become more secretive and therefore more difficult to monitor or control. Church officials became experts at maintaining elaborate fictions about their activities while continuing practices that were more extensive and more damaging than those that had existed before reform efforts began. Italian reform leaders, like Cardinal Pier Damiani, documented the psychological toll of failed reform efforts on clergy who had initially been enthusiastic supporters of change. Many experienced what would now be recognized as severe depression as they realized that their efforts had not only failed, but had actually made the problems worse. Some abandoned reform efforts entirely and embraced the corruption they had previously opposed, while others left church service altogether rather than continue participating in systems they could neither reform nor accept. The long-term institutional damage was severe and permanent. Reform failures established precedents that made future reform efforts more difficult because clergy had learned sophisticated techniques for resisting change while maintaining appearances of compliance. The failed Gregorian reforms created a template for ecclesiastical resistance that would be used to undermine reform movements for centuries, contributing to the eventual Protestant Reformation and permanent divisions within Christianity. The international implications were significant because reform failures in one region affected church credibility throughout Europe. Secular rulers, who had initially supported church reform efforts, became skeptical of papal authority when those efforts produced no visible improvements in clerical behavior. This skepticism contributed to increasing secular control over church institutions and reduced papal influence in international affairs. The most tragic aspect of reform failures was their impact on the victims of clerical abuse. Many people who had hoped that reform movements would provide protection from predatory clergy discovered that the new systems actually provided better camouflage for abusers, while offering no additional protections for victims. The failed reforms had created more sophisticated abuse systems while maintaining public facades of moral improvement. The economic data reveals the true scope of reform failure. Church revenues from sexual commerce continued to increase throughout the supposed reform period, reaching their highest levels in the decades immediately following the most intensive reform efforts. The reform movement had inadvertently created market conditions that made sexual corruption more profitable than ever before, while providing better protection for the participants. The documentation of reform failures provides crucial insights into the structural problems that made medieval church corruption so persistent and resistant to change. The failures weren't due to insufficient commitment or inadequate leadership. They were the inevitable result of attempting to reform systems that had become so integral to institutional operations that removing them would have required completely rebuilding the church from the ground up. This pattern of failed reform would repeat throughout medieval church history, with each subsequent effort encountering the same structural obstacles and producing the same disappointing results. The great reformers weren't moral failures. They were intelligent, committed individuals who underestimated the complexity of the problems they were trying to solve, and the sophisticated resistance they would encounter from systems that had evolved specifically to protect themselves from reform efforts. The reckoning that never came. You're standing in the ruins of medieval Catholic moral authority in 1517, watching Martin Luther nail his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and you realize you're witnessing the inevitable consequence of centuries of systematic sexual corruption that the church had refused to address. The Protestant Reformation wasn't primarily about theological disagreements. It was the delayed reckoning for an institution that had spent over 4 centuries treating celibacy as a marketing slogan while operating the largest sexual exploitation enterprise in European history. The documentation of institutional collapse is overwhelming and comes from the church's own records, which had become so normalized to corruption that administrators continued documenting their criminal activities even as the institution crumbled around them. Papal archives from the early 16th century contain routine correspondence about managing pregnant concubines, distributing church positions based on sexual services, and coordinating international child trafficking operations. These weren't hidden activities discovered by investigators. They were standard administrative procedures documented with the same bureaucratic efficiency used for recording grain purchases. The mathematical calculation of corruption had reached levels that made reform impossible without complete institutional destruction. Economic analysis of church records reveals that by 1500, sexual commerce generated more revenue for Catholic institutions than all traditional religious activities combined. Tithing, indulgence sales, pilgrimage fees, and charitable donations together produced less income than the sophisticated prostitution and child trafficking networks that had become the church's primary economic engine. Any meaningful reform would have bankrupted the institution and eliminated its ability to function. The Protestant reformers weren't moral innovators. They were practical observers who recognized that Catholic sexual corruption had created market opportunities for alternative religious leadership. Lutheran and Calvinist churches gained adherents, not primarily through theological arguments, but by offering religious services without the systematic sexual exploitation that had become synonymous with Catholicism. The Reformation succeeded because it provided an alternative to an institution that had become indistinguishable from a criminal organization. The scale of victimization had reached levels that threatened social stability throughout Europe. Demographic analysis suggests that by the late medieval period, approximately 15% of the European population had been directly affected by clerical sexual abuse, either as primary victims or as family members of victims. Entire regions contained populations where monastery-born children formed significant demographic groups, creating social tensions that secular authorities could no longer ignore or manage. German princes who embraced Protestantism weren't primarily motivated by religious conviction. They were responding to popular pressure from populations that had suffered centuries of sexual exploitation by Catholic clergy. The political support for Protestant churches came largely from communities that viewed the Reformation as an opportunity to escape from predatory religious leadership. Secular rulers discovered that supporting Protestant alternatives was more politically advantageous than defending Catholic institutions that had lost all moral credibility. French Catholic administrators attempted desperate damage control measures that only highlighted the extent of institutional corruption. The Reform Protocols of 1523 were elaborate procedures designed to manage ongoing sexual commerce while maintaining appearances of moral authority. These protocols included standardized pricing for sexual services, quality control measures for church-sponsored prostitution, and administrative procedures for handling the children produced by clerical relationships. Rather than eliminating corruption, the protocols attempted to make it more efficient and less publicly visible. English church records document the systematic destruction of evidence as Protestant influence grew and Catholic authorities realized the legal vulnerability created by centuries of documented criminal activity. The Archive Purification Project involved destroying thousands of documents that provided evidence of sexual exploitation, child trafficking, and financial corruption. However, enough documentation survived to provide overwhelming evidence of systematic institutional criminality that had operated for over 4 centuries. Spanish Inquisition records reveal that church authorities were more concerned about protecting sexual predators than identifying heretics. Inquisition courts routinely processed cases involving clergy accused of sexual abuse, but the typical resolution involved transferring perpetrators to new locations rather than imposing meaningful punishment. The Inquisition had essentially become a system for managing clerical sexual misconduct rather than protecting Catholic orthodoxy. Italian papal courts continued operating elaborate sexual entertainment systems even as Blavins. Protestant alternatives gained popularity throughout Northern Europe. The spiritual recreation events, documented in Vatican archives from the 1520s, describe papal orgies that involved cardinals, prostitutes, and what were euphemistically called young spiritual assistants. These events were so routine that detailed administrative procedures existed for their planning and execution, suggesting that papal sexual entertainment had become institutionalized beyond any possibility of reform. The psychological impact on surviving victims created generations of people who viewed all religious authority with deep suspicion and hostility. Contemporary chronicles describe populations that had become so traumatized by clerical sexual abuse that they rejected Christianity altogether rather than risk continued victimization. The church had created its own opposition by systematically betraying the trust of people who had looked to religious institutions for spiritual guidance and moral leadership. The economic collapse was inevitable because the church's financial systems had become completely dependent on criminal revenues that couldn't be sustained once their nature became widely known. As Protestant alternatives gained credibility, the market for Catholic sexual services declined precipitously, creating financial crises that forced many Catholic institutions to cease operations. Churches, monasteries, and religious schools that had operated profitably for centuries suddenly faced bankruptcy as their primary revenue sources disappeared. The international implications were catastrophic for Catholic political influence. European rulers who had traditionally relied on church support for legitimacy discovered that association with Catholic institutions had become politically toxic. The Holy Roman Empire fragmented along religious lines, not because of theological disagreements, but because populations refused to accept political leadership that was associated with institutions known for systematic sexual exploitation. The cultural impact was permanent and profound. European literature, art, and popular culture developed lasting associations between Catholic religious authority and sexual hypocrisy that persisted for centuries beyond the medieval period. The image of the corrupt priest became a standard character in literature, theater, and popular entertainment, reflecting deep social trauma that had been created by centuries of systematic abuse. The demographic consequences were staggering and long-lasting. Regions that had been dominated by Catholic institutions showed measurably different population characteristics, including higher rates of illegitimate births, increased prevalence of certain genetic disorders associated with inbreeding, and unusual surname distributions that reflected the widespread practice of monks and priests fathering children. These demographic markers persisted for generations and provided long-term evidence of the scale of medieval sexual corruption. The legal aftermath created precedents that would influence European law for centuries. Secular courts that had previously deferred to ecclesiastical authority began asserting jurisdiction over crimes committed by religious figures. The principle of clerical immunity from secular law enforcement, which had protected abusive clergy for centuries, was gradually eliminated as populations demanded accountability for sexual crimes that had been systematically covered up by church authorities. The institutional memory of medieval Catholic sexual corruption became a permanent feature of European cultural consciousness. Even regions that remained Catholic maintained folk traditions, popular songs, and cultural references that reflected deep awareness of clerical sexual abuse. These cultural memories served as persistent reminders of institutional betrayal that had affected entire populations and continued to influence attitudes toward religious authority long after the specific events had passed into history. The greatest tragedy was that the reckoning, when it finally came, was too late to help the millions of victims who had suffered centuries of systematic sexual exploitation. The Protestant Reformation provided alternative religious options for future generations, but it couldn't restore the innocence that had been destroyed, heal the psychological trauma that had been inflicted, or compensate for the lives that had been damaged by an institution that had betrayed its most fundamental responsibilities while claiming divine authority. The medieval Catholic Church's sexual corruption wasn't an aberration or a temporary failure of moral leadership. It was the logical consequence of creating institutional systems that combined absolute power with minimal accountability. The Church had accidentally discovered that religious authority could be used to facilitate sexual exploitation on an unprecedented scale, and it had chosen profit over principle for so long that reform became impossible without complete institutional destruction. Tonight's journey through this dark chapter of human history serves as a reminder that no institution, regardless of its claimed moral authority or spiritual purpose, is immune to corruption when proper safeguards and accountability measures are absent. The medieval church's failure wasn't just a religious crisis, it was a human catastrophe that demonstrates the devastating consequences when power is allowed to operate without oversight, accountability, or meaningful consequences for abuse. The story we've explored tonight isn't just about medieval history. It's about the eternal human struggle between power and principle, authority and accountability, institutional interests and individual welfare. The lessons learned from this dark period continue to resonate today as we grapple with similar challenges in modern institutions and seek to create systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. As we conclude tonight's examination of medieval Catholic sexual corruption, remember that the greatest tribute we can pay to the victims of these historic abuses is to remain vigilant against similar patterns in contemporary institutions. The darkness we've explored tonight serves as a warning light, illuminating the pathways that lead from moral authority to institutional corruption and reminding us that the price of freedom from exploitation is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse positions of trust. The medieval period ended. The Protestant Reformation transformed European Christianity, and the specific systems of corruption we've examined tonight were eventually dismantled. But the human capacity for both exploitation and resistance continues, and our responsibility to learn from history's darkest chapters remains as urgent today as it was 500 years ago when reformers first began demanding accountability from institutions that had forgotten their purpose and betrayed their trust.